He only glanced at the photo on the restaurant counter, and his whole body twisted in pain. He tried to get up and step outside for some air, but lost his balance, snapped his lover's necklace, and then fell straight to the floor. But his lover did not rush to help him. Instead, she stepped over him to pick up the fallen pearls. As his favorite song, Gloomy Sunday, played in the background, 80-year-old Hans lost his life just like that. Once the news broke, media outlets across the country rushed to report it, and people nationwide mourned him of their own accord, all because during World War II, he had single-handedly saved more than 1,000 Jews in Budapest. But only the restaurant owner knew that Hans was a devil, so after his body was taken away, the restaurant owner opened a bottle of champagne to celebrate. Then he carried 2 glasses of wine into the kitchen and said to the silver-haired woman humming Gloomy Sunday, wearing a blue gemstone hairpin, "Mom, happy 80th birthday." At that moment, the woman was washing out the bottle that had held the poison. This woman was the woman in the photograph. She had waited more than half a century for the moment Hans died. 60 years earlier, on this very day, Hans had come to this restaurant. Only back then, the focus was not him, but a woman named Ilona. Ilona's birthday was on the same day as Hans's. One was as beautiful as an angel, capturing the hearts of many men. The other was a fanatical hothead, soon to transform into a true monster. That day, Ilona received 3 birthday gifts from 3 different men. Hans used a new German-made camera to take a photograph of her. The restaurant owner, who was also her lover, gave her a hairpin set with a blue gemstone, and the restaurant's pianist, Andras, composed the piece Gloomy Sunday for her. The melody sounded like weeping and sorrow, as if drawing a person into a sacred darkness. This piece was Ilona's favorite birthday gift. The way she looked at Andras was also overflowing with admiration. Ilona was almost every man's muse once he had seen her. She had no shortage of admirers, but before the pianist appeared, Laszlo had never seen that look in her eyes. Not only that, the sharp-eyed Laszlo also noticed that Ilona treated Andras with special care in daily life. She would even lean over the piano between serving dishes and whisper to him. But Laszlo was a kind man. Although he noticed a few clues, he did not target Andras because of them. Instead, when he learned that Andras was short on money and could not afford a new suit, he generously offered to help. And to avoid hurting the man's pride, he added that Andras could pay him back for the suit once he made a fortune with his music. By now, Laszlo had been with Ilona for 4 years. Only now did he understand that although he had moved into Ilona's life, Andras had clearly moved into Ilona's soul. After closing time that night, all 3 men followed beside Ilona. Hans was the first to seize a chance to be alone with her, so he took the opportunity to confess his feelings to Ilona. He also promised he would open Germany's largest import-export company and let Ilona live a happy life. But Ilona only smiled and rejected him outright. Because for Ilona, who studied music and worshipped freedom, Hans's proposal felt far too ordinary and practical. Besides, in her eyes, Hans was only a stranger who had eaten at the restaurant a few times. She could not possibly go with a stranger to a strange country. What was more, the man she loved was already here. After being rejected, Hans could only leave in disappointment. At this time, the remaining 3 also reached a fork in the road. After kissing Andras goodbye, Ilona still could not bear to part from him. Seeing this, Laszlo did not force her to go home with him. He gave her time alone and let her follow her own heart to make a choice. Although he acted very generous, when he discovered that Ilona had ultimately chosen Andras, Laszlo still went to the Danube in heartbreak. That night, Ilona and the pianist were lost in passion. Laszlo stood alone on the bridge, lonely and desolate, staring at the scenery. Suddenly, the sound of someone falling into the water shattered the silence of the night and interrupted Laszlo's sorrow. It turned out that Hans, trapped by love, had jumped into the river to end his life. Fortunately, Laszlo ignored the cold, rescued him, and patiently comforted him. Love is not the only thing in this world. People should think more about other beautiful things. For example, how is your favorite beef roll made? It is made by cleverly combining garlic, cream, and ham. Although these 3 ingredients seem completely unrelated, if they are handled properly, they can create a harmonious and delicious dish. On the surface, these words were meant to comfort Hans, but in truth, they revealed Laszlo's real view of love. After that, to keep Hans from doing anything foolish again, Laszlo took him back to his own home. The next day, he personally sent Hans onto the train back to Germany. Before they parted, Hans said solemnly to Laszlo, "You saved my life, and one day I will repay you." But no one could have imagined that this life-saving kindness would later become a story of the farmer and the snake because of the changing times. After seeing Hans off, Laszlo went to the market alone to buy supplies, only to happen upon Ilona and Andras. Ilona held a large bouquet of purple flowers and stood in the sunlight with Andras, looking like a perfect couple blessed by heaven. At that moment, the two of them also spotted Laszlo in the crowd, and guilt appeared on both their faces, but Ilona still walked over and kissed Laszlo first. Although Laszlo wanted to refuse, his body honestly leaned into it, and that kiss made Laszlo see the situation even more clearly. He understood Ilona's feelings for Andras, and he was willing to accept all of Ilona, so he decided to share Ilona with Andras, because in his eyes, having half of Ilona was still better than having none of her, and the other two quietly accepted this way of being together. From then on, the three of them lived together in this strange yet harmonious arrangement. Even more shocking, the two men did not fight over jealousy. Instead, they became very close friends. Of course, the happiest person of all was Ilona, because she had both real-world stability and a soulmate in music. One day, a producer from a Vienna record company came to the restaurant for dinner. Laszlo and Ilona both realized that this was Andras' chance, so Laszlo deliberately arranged the timing and had Andras play Gloomy Sunday. At first, Andras had no idea what was going on, but he still did as he was told. In the end, the piece was indeed noticed by the three producers. Andras could hardly believe that such an opportunity had come to him, but he did not understand business at all. So he wanted Laszlo to be his manager. The payment would be 10% of his royalties. But when Laszlo heard this, he smiled and said, "That hurts my feelings. You cannot take money for helping a friend." So after the restaurant closed, Laszlo negotiated the record deal with the producers. With his sharp mind and outstanding negotiating skills, Laszlo secured the highest royalties for Andras. Not only that, he also required that whenever the song was played on the radio, they had to mention that it was created in the restaurant. That way, both Andras and the restaurant would gain more fame, and the producers agreed to all of these conditions. After the negotiation succeeded, all three of them were immersed in joy. None of them knew what terrible consequences the birth of the song would bring. Not long afterward, the producer invited Andras to Vienna to record the song. Andras wanted Ilona to go with him, and Ilona wanted Laszlo to come too, but Laszlo refused, saying the restaurant could not close. And so, Ilona and Andras went to Vienna together, leaving Laszlo alone in loneliness. Although he was willing to share Ilona with someone else, he would still feel deep jealousy from time to time, and that fire of jealousy did not fully vanish until Gloomy Sunday officially aired on the radio and the name of his restaurant was mentioned with it. To celebrate the successful release of the song, the three went up to the rooftop, leisurely drinking while admiring Budapest under the night sky. Laszlo sighed that this feeling was truly wonderful. As long as the song kept playing, he could do nothing at all and still have money flowing into his pocket. But Andras felt there was still a small regret, because even though he had personally created the piece, he still did not understand what it truly expressed. Laszlo told him not to put too much pressure on himself, because musicians create with heart and emotion, and whether the mind can fully understand it does not matter. These were supposed to be comforting words, but Andras heard them as an insult, because in front of the wealthy and clever Laszlo, he had always felt inferior. So in a fit of spite, he deliberately said that he was simply an emotional person, unlike you Jews, whose heads are full of business, bargaining over everything you do. Seeing that the two men were about to erupt into an argument, Ilona tried to ease the tension between them, but unexpectedly drew the fire onto herself. Laszlo said from the side that if it were not for you, neither of us would be like this. Andras echoed him from the side. Ilona said nothing, she simply left on her own in anger, but the two men, both suffering from the same heartache, became even better friends because of that argument. They even slept in the same bed that night. When they saw Ilona the next day, both men apologized deeply, but Ilona wanted to break up with both of them at the same time, because she did not want all three of them to be unhappy. But how could the two men possibly agree to that? Before long, the three of them made up again. As Gloomy Sunday swept across Europe, the restaurant's business grew more and more prosperous. That night, a group of social elites came because of the song's reputation. Andras personally played the piece as well. Throughout the whole performance, everyone listened as if spellbound. One young and beautiful girl in particular was deeply captivated by the wonderful notes. As the piano keys moved, her originally high spirits slowly sank, and a depressed look gradually covered her eyes. Not only that, after returning home that night, she chose to cut her wrist and end her life. At that moment, Gloomy Sunday was still playing in the room. Many people could not understand why a wealthy young woman from such a good family would take her own life. Perhaps she was like a bird in a cage, able only to struggle, but never truly escape. when Andres was suddenly interviewed by reporters, he learned that at least 5 people had already ended their lives while listening to his song, and because of that, his heart became filled with guilt. So he bought a bottle of poison, intending to die as an apology. Fortunately, Ilona had also heard about the 5 suicides, and knowing Andres's personality, she realized he might do something foolish out of guilt. So when she saw that Andres had not come to the restaurant, she immediately took Laszlo and searched everywhere for him. Thankfully, in the end, they saw Andres's broken figure on the bridge. To erase Andres's thoughts of death, Laszlo and Ilona took turns comforting him. When Ilona said that if he was going to die, then all 3 of them should die together, Andres finally smiled in relief. And just in case, Laszlo took the bottle of poison away. But over the next 8 weeks, in Hungary alone, more than 150 people listened to that song and took their own lives. At the same time, World War II broke out in full force. The German Nazis advanced with overwhelming momentum, sweeping across everything in their path. Hans, who had returned to Germany, also joined the army, and 3 years later, he became an officer. One day, now successful and powerful, he returned to the restaurant. When Laszlo recognized him, Hans was polite on the surface, but when he heard Laszlo call him by name, he still put on airs and said that when outsiders were present, he should be called Colonel. That arrogant expression clearly showed he had forgotten that without Laszlo saving his life back then, he would never have had this glory now. Not only that, he insisted on going into the kitchen to take a look. Then he shamelessly struck the piano keys right in front of Andres. But 3 years earlier, Laszlo had told him that guests were not allowed in the kitchen and were not allowed to touch the piano. Now, however, Hans had become a petty villain. He deliberately wanted to break the so-called restaurant rules to prove that the new him could do anything. Laszlo understood the situation well and silently went along with everything. That evening, Hans brought his superior to the restaurant for dinner. The moment the superior saw Laszlo, he recognized him as Jewish, and their mission in Hungary this time was to carry out the plan against the Jewish people. But tonight, they did not plan to work. They only wanted to enjoy the food and wine to their heart's content, so they did not stagger out until the restaurant closed. But just as they stepped outside, the superior, having drunk too much, lost his footing and happened to crash into Laszlo. Both of them fell to the ground. Laszlo was clearly an innocent bystander, but the superior ignored right and wrong, not only beating and kicking him, but even drawing his pistol to execute him. Fortunately, Hans stepped forward in time and stopped him, saving Laszlo's life. Andres and Ilona, who had not gone far, also turned back. Because Laszlo was badly injured, Andres decided to take him home, and after sending his superior away, Hans took responsibility for escorting the frightened Ilona home. Although 3 years had passed since they last met, Hans's obsession with Ilona had not faded at all. The moment he brought Ilona through the door, he could not wait to confess his feelings again. He said that being with someone like you, an angel, would not count as betraying his wife. Faced with such nauseating lines from a shameless man, Ilona chose to fight absurdity with absurdity. She said, "We angels are rather conservative, and we do not fool around." Rejected again, Hans did not keep pestering her, but as he went downstairs, he happened to run into Andres returning, so he deliberately straightened his clothes in front of Andres, as if something had already happened, and sure enough, the naturally sensitive Andres believed it. Because of that, he did not go upstairs, but walked straight outside with resentment in his heart. The next day, Ilona went to dress Laszlo's wounds. By now, news that the Germans intended to eliminate the Jews had spread across the country. The two of them also began discussing how to respond. In the end, to protect the restaurant, Laszlo decided to transfer ownership to Ilona, who was not Jewish, and have it legally restored after everything calmed down. Although the two were not married, they trusted each other completely. In addition, to save Laszlo's life, Ilona decided to ask Hans for help and get a certificate proving that Laszlo had been drafted into the army. But when she found Hans, he was handling a major matter. It turned out that the property of the local wealthy Jewish businessmen had to be forcibly transferred to Germany. If the businessmen refused, their entire families would be sent to concentration camps, and almost everyone chose the former, because compared with their family's safety, money meant nothing. After a long time, Ilona finally met Hans, and after hearing Ilona's request, Hans repeatedly guaranteed that with him around, Laszlo would be absolutely safe. But in the end, he never issued any written proof. Ilona, thinking the matter had been settled, was extremely happy and walked lightly out of Hans's office. But this scene was seen by Andres, who was waiting outside. Andres questioned her, asking why she had stayed inside for 57 minutes, and whether two men still were not enough to satisfy her. Faced with the accusation and distrust from the man she loved, Ilona answered him directly with a slap. That night, Hans brought people to the restaurant for dinner again, perhaps because he felt he held Laszlo's life in his hands, or perhaps because he wanted to show his superiority in front of others. His attitude toward Laszlo was no longer friendly, but became extremely arrogant. He even asked Laszlo to tell him a Jewish joke, although Laszlo resisted deeply inside. As a businessman, he had no choice but to keep the peace. Nervously, he told a joke about concentration camps, subtly mocking the pettiness of Nazi officers. When he finished, Hans and his superiors stared at him without expression. Everyone around them was too frightened to make a sound. The clever part of the joke was that if Hans became angry, he would truly become the petty officer in the joke. To save face, he could only pretend to be broad-minded. Sure enough, after a moment, Hans and his superior both burst into loud laughter. Laszlo was so frightened that cold sweat covered his body. He had just breathed a sigh of relief when Hans ordered Andras to play Gloomy Sunday. He wanted to trample these two men mercilessly in front of Ilona, but compared with Laszlo's smoothness and worldly wisdom, Andras was much more rigid and straightforward. He was unwilling to put down his dignity and serve someone he hated. So after hearing Hans's order, he only stared stubbornly at Hans, while his body did not move at all, and Hans refused to back down, confronting him in silence. Seeing Hans about to lose patience, Ilona quickly walked to the piano and began singing the lyrics Andras had recently written for Gloomy Sunday.
Trauriger Sonntag, dein Abend ist nicht mehr weit.
Hearing her voice, Andras could hardly believe his ears, because Ilona had told him long ago that she only sang when she was alone. But now, to keep him from losing his life, Ilona had no choice but to go against her own principles and bow her head to power. This filled Andras's heart with endless sorrow. Even so, at Ilona's request, he began to play the accompaniment. When the song ended, Hans listened as if enchanted. Everyone present also applauded and praised them. Ilona, however, forced down the discomfort in her heart and ran to the restroom alone to calm herself. But before she could recover, a sharp gunshot suddenly rang out outside. When she went over to check, she saw Andras already lying in a pool of blood. It turned out that just before ending his life, Andras finally understood the true meaning contained in Gloomy Sunday. He also understood why more than 150 people had walked toward the end, because compared with living without dignity and freedom, it was better to end life with dignity. So after seeing the woman he loved bow down for him, Andras resolutely grabbed Hans's pistol and ended his own life with his own hands. After Andras's funeral, Hans appeared by car. He wanted to show Ilona his so-called devotion, but she saw him as an executioner and shoved him away. Unwilling to give up, Hans then asked Laszlo what he could do. Laszlo wanted him to help get a pass so he could avoid this bloody storm. Hearing this, that arrogant smile appeared on Hans's face again. He said, "As long as I am here, you are safe, but the condition is that you must behave and do as you were told." After saying this, he assigned a task on the spot. He wanted Laszlo to find wealthy people among the Jewish community, then trade each person's $1,000 to Hans for a ticket to life. In just a few days, Laszlo saw clearly how cold and warm human nature could become in chaotic times. He also saw through Hans and realized he was no different from the officer in the joke. Both were simply using the power in their hands to do things that erased their humanity. After saying goodbye to Hans, Laszlo found Ilona and said that he seemed to have understood the meaning of Andras's song. As long as a person still has a shred of dignity, they can endure every humiliation, but if someone pours one more bucket of filth over your head, perhaps leaving with dignity is the best choice. In simple terms, a person may be killed, but not humiliated. Ilona heard the sorrow in his words and feared that he would walk the same road as Andras, so she comforted him, saying, "You still have me, and you still have happiness worth fighting for." The next day, the restaurant that never closed shut its doors in mourning for Andras, and Laszlo also began continuously sending Jewish customers to Hans, because no matter what, this could still save some Jewish lives. Sometimes, Hans would take advantage of their desperation and charge extra money. Sometimes, he would pretend to be merciful and return the money. He did this not because his conscience had awakened, but because he felt that if the tide turned one day, these people's testimony might save his life at a crucial moment. One day, after sending away the last group of customers, Hans opened a box full of gold, silver, and jewels. Inside were his trophies, and also the lives of countless Jews. Not long afterward, Laszlo and Ilona received a money order. It turned out to be Andras's will. It stated that all royalties earned from the song would be split equally between Laszlo and Ilona. At that moment, a news report came over the radio saying that the Soviet Red Army had entered Hungary. This meant that the day of liberation was drawing closer and closer, but Laszlo could no longer wait until that day, because he knew too many of Hans's secrets. Hans had placed him on the death list after using him up. Luckily, when German soldiers came to arrest him, he escaped with the help of his neighbors, but he also knew very well that in the face of absolute power, there was no real chance of survival. So that day, he wrote a suicide note and hid it inside the restaurant's piano. Then he took out the poison Andras had once prepared for his own death, wanting to leave with dignity before he was arrested. But in the end, the German soldiers found him first. During the struggle, the poison slipped out of his pocket. By the time Ilona heard the news and rushed to the restaurant, Laszlo had already been forced into a vehicle. Only then did Ilona truly understand what despair felt like, but still holding on to one last thread of hope, she rode her bicycle to ask Hans for help. At that moment, Hans was packing his luggage, preparing to return to Germany. After learning why Ilona had come, he quickly said he would definitely save Laszlo. As he spoke, he kissed Ilona. This time, Ilona did not refuse, and she could not refuse, because this might be the only chance to save Laszlo. Afterward, Hans really did obtain a special pardon from his superior and rushed non-stop to the train station to submit the release document. Laszlo, who was about to board the death train, thought Hans had found his conscience and come to save him, and hope for life rekindled in his eyes. But cruelly, Hans only looked at him coldly for a moment. Then he quickly rescued a mathematics professor from the line of death, because the professor was famous and would be more useful in the future. Just 3 years earlier, at this very same train station, Laszlo had personally sent Hans onto the train home as the man who had saved his life. Now, Hans had become Laszlo's executioner, personally sending him into Auschwitz, a place with no way out. At this time, Ilona, knowing nothing, came to the restaurant alone. She not only found the poison bottle that had fallen on the ground, but also discovered the suicide note Laszlo had left behind. The letter said, "I will not wait for the final bucket of filth to be poured over me. I will choose, like Andras, to leave with dignity. But please, you must hold on and wait for all of this to pass." Although Laszlo failed to preserve his dignity as he wished, Ilona listened to his words and lived on with strength. A few months later, the war had passed, and the restaurant reopened. Ilona, now heavily pregnant, once again came to Andras's grave. By now, Andras's tombstone was already surrounded by lush grass, and no one even knew where Laszlo had been buried. Ilona spoke of the pain of missing them both. In the blink of an eye, more than 50 years passed. Laszlo's restaurant still kept its old furnishings, except the owner had become a strange man who looked very much like Laszlo. One day, the owner received word that a wealthy man from Berlin had specifically requested to hold his 80th birthday here. Without a doubt, this man was Hans. Back then, he had made a fortune from the war and become the president of Germany's largest import-export company, and by using the people he had saved, he successfully whitewashed himself, transforming from a hypocritical and vicious Nazi officer into the greatest benefactor of Budapest. To show respect, the restaurant owner personally received him and instructed the kitchen to serve the beef rolls he had loved in his youth. But even that was not enough for Hans, so he called over the musicians to play Gloomy Sunday. Then he enjoyed the delicious food while listening to the music. Just as he was full of himself, feeling that his life had finally come full circle, he suddenly saw the photo on the piano that he had personally taken of Ilona. Then, the opening scene happened. Gloomy Sunday was directed by Rolf Schubel. Ilona had a beauty beyond compare, and at the same time, she possessed the most perfect love, because she was with two lovers at once. One gave her material security, while the other enriched her spiritual world. You could say that she had both body and soul, but the world seems unable to tolerate a life that is too perfect. Ilona's once beautiful life was completely shattered by the arrival of a third man. This man used the power in his hands not only to make Ilona lose the two men she loved most, but also to make her suffer a humiliation she had never known before. But she did not choose to end her life because of it. Instead, decades later, she avenged her lovers with her own hands.